I think it's really important that we first and foremost look at a stroke survivor as a human being, right?
Welcome to the Strokecast. A Generation X stroke survivor explores rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand.
Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 108 of the Strokecast. Today, we're going to talk about the field in stroke world that has probably the worst branding of any of them: speech therapy. California-based speech therapist and author Tsgoyna Tanzman, and yes, I did practice pronouncing that, is the author of Hope After Stroke for Caregivers and Survivors, the holistic guide to getting your life back. Tsgoyna wrote the book to be a guide to folks, living life after stroke. While she does go into details about things like aphasia and the taxonomy around the different types of aphasia, as well as, of course, things like sex and walking and all of this other stuff, I do find it to be a fairly easy book to read. She doesn't get lost in the medical jargon, which is really nice. In this conversation, we talk about different types of aphasia, about what it means to experience cognitive deficits following a stroke, about how to manage overstimulation, the impact race can have on post-stroke care, and really a whole lot more. So now, let's meet Tsgoyna. Tsgoyna, thank you so much for joining us here on Strokecast this week.
Well, I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
I was very pleased with reading your emails when you reached out to me. It was all very flattering. And I always love talking with speech pathologists because while it's not a specialty I had to take advantage of, I find language itself and the process behind language just fascinating, which is probably why I have a podcast. So as I've talked with other speech therapists in the past, this is one of those specialties that probably has some of the absolute worst branding in the stroke recovery field, right up there with the occupational therapists who still have not found me my next job. But what is it that a speech therapist does?
Wow, that is a very big question. And you're right. I think our branding is a little off because when we go in to work with a patient on cognitive issues, people are confused why we're doing memory when you're a speech therapist. So the field of speech therapy is broad. It's very broad. And it includes speech, which is actually how we pronounce and produce words, but it also includes language. And so we work with people who have neurologic conditions like stroke and traumatic brain injury. We work with the areas of autism. We are doing work with voice, swallowing, articulation, as I mentioned. The field is just enormously broad. I think at one point they're going to really have to specialize. Voice, I don't know if I mentioned voice as well. But those are so many components that we work with. And often we work with those within stroke recovery. A lot of cognitive therapy takes place, and it's just a big field.
So you mentioned cognitive issues. What exactly do you mean by cognitive issues?
So cognition is really about how we think. And these are the things that really enable us to be independent in our lives. So they include planning, memory, organization. We take a task that we take for granted, like going to a supermarket, for example. Well, that means that you have to plan how you're going to get from the car, not just physically, but cognitively, mentally, where that you're getting into the entrance, that you are going to then search for the one thing that you came for. Oh, by the way, did you remember that? And then finding that in this vast store. Do you need to use cues to show you which aisle it's in? Do you have to be able to scan that aisle and zero in on the one feature? Or maybe you don't know what you're looking for. So cognition is really that intangible ability to think and to remember and to plan and to organize, to also inhibit reactions and to respond appropriately.
I think one of the things that most folks never think about when it comes to the brain is how much time and how much resources it spends towards not doing things, whether that is filtering out all of the noise and visual stimuli that we don't need. If your filters are working, you don't hear the fan from your computer and the air conditioner kicking on all the time and the traffic on the street. But if you stop to think about it, you can absolutely hear all those things. But the brain is spending so much time just dumping that information out so we don't waste energy processing it. And once that filter is offline, it can be incredibly overwhelming and exhausting. And at the same time, as you mentioned, those challenges with inhibition, cognition is about the brain saying, parts of the brain saying to other parts, don't do that, stop that. And when that gets damaged, it becomes a very interesting challenge to have to work through that. And some of our caregivers are really going to struggle with that.
You're absolutely right. It's unknown to a caregiver really how much information is being literally assaulting the other person. It's that inability to use that filter, that problem that filter has, gotten faulty. And you are assaulted by a lot of stimuli, and that can really contribute to neurofatigue as well as increased agitation. That's why, very often caregivers will say, my loved one doesn't want to go to social gatherings anymore, and they feel very isolated. Well, they don't realize what energy is being expended, as you said, in just trying to keep the extraneous, unimportant information that's assaulting them at bay. So it does take a lot of energy. And I like to say the best a caregiver can hear about that is imagine your worst headache and also feeling really terrible, like your worst stomach ache, and then going to a concert and everybody is talking to you and there are lights going and you're hearing this noise and you're being jostled back and forth. And they start to then get a sense like, oh, it doesn't look that way to them, but when they have that personal experience, they can then sometimes to relate to how difficult what seems so simple to them really is for another person.
And then so as a speech therapist working with cognitive issues, those are some of those things you help train folks to deal with and adapt to.
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of that has to do with, very common sense things. I like to say common sense is not always common practice, but there are common sense things. Number one, if you are going to go to an event that will potentially be overwhelming to you, number one, back end and front end, make sure that you've had adequate rest. Make sure that you can locate a place in that space where you can decrease the amount of stimulation. Maybe focus on talking to one person in another part of a room. Those kinds of strategies aid those kinds of situations.
We're seeing a lot of events in the tech space from organizations that are more aware of challenges around disability. They are actually setting up quiet rooms at conferences like 30 years ago when we were allowed to go to conferences, which is just a quiet space to step away from some of that stimulation. I saw it start from areas of concern for folks with autism, but where it's the same sort of thing for folks who are subject to overstimulation. Just being able to step away from that environment can make a difference and can help you save some spoons when you really need them.
Yes, absolutely.
Can you, and one of the things in your book that I hadn't really thought about was the different categories of aphasia. Could you take us through that?
Sure. So aphasia, if you aphasia essentially means a loss of language, but it's not just spoken language. It's also what we understand. And it also includes nonverbal language. It includes reading. It includes writing. So these are all ways that we communicate and use language, even, as I said, non-verbally. And so the big broad categories of aphasia are separated into two big broad categories, the fluent and the non-fluent. And within those categories, they can go from the least severe to the most severe. So there's a type of aphasia called anomic aphasia. And those are the typical word-finding difficulties. So the person might have intact grammar, but it would sound something like this. They're trying to describe something. So they might say, the thing, for watering, I use it in the garden. It's long, but they can't come up with the word hose. So they have all these other words, but they can't come up with that. That's considered the least severe. And then we move to another type of fluent aphasia, which is called Wernicke's aphasia. Now, speech can be fluent here, but it can be very far from normal. So what's interesting about people that have Wernicke's aphasia is they might have intact articulation, so they pronounce their words correctly. They might have great rhythm and flow and prosody of language, so they sound good. But when you listen to the content of their sentences, they often have a lot of jargon, made-up words. Now, they may have some automatic speech. These are the kinds of folks that can get easily dismissed or missed, really, when they're in the hospital, because a physician might come and spend a very few minutes with them and say, Mrs. Smith, how are you doing? Oh, fine. Everything's good. And they'd say, well, do you know where you are? Oh, yes. And then if you probe a little deeper, I've had this happen with two patients of mine, where I read the chart and they said, patient is oriented. And because the doctor said, do you know where you are? And they said, yes. And I said, where are you? And then he started on this whole thing about how he was in the 1865 Civil War. I mean, it went on. It was like, oh, all right, we've got a problem. or the Wernicke's aphasia person who's speaking can say, oh, everything's fine. And then you say, well, tell me about this. What'd you have for lunch? And they might say, the Fleberjab left the beflabamus in the catastrophization. And you go, what? So Wernicke's aphasia is a really tricky one. And then we move to what we call...
And I think just one of the things that I think is really interesting to point out there, too, is when you're talking about those scripts that work fine, what I think is really interesting is that points to that core principle of neuroplasticity that we talk about all the time. The nerves that fire together wire together. We build up those daily scripts of, hey, how are you doing? I'm doing well, doing awesome, everything's fine. Whatever it is that you answer all the time, you've said that so many times. You've got just this hardwired connection taking up more brain real estate versus, just the memory of what you had for lunch that day.
Yes, and that's what we call that automatic speech that comes so easily. It's so, as you say, hardwired into your brain. Exactly. And then we move to more into the non-fluent aphasia. So it's a mixed one, which is, the speech can be very sparse and limited, but they have some more limited comprehension. And reading and writing skills are also at a very elementary level. Then we start to move into even more non-fluent aphasia, which they call Broca's aphasia. And this is where speech is very severely reduced to maybe less than 4 words. Vocabulary is limited. The speech is very halting, very effortful, and comprehension and reading may also be intact, but they might have limited writing. So I have worked with patients who's literally, they've had one word. Can you imagine? One word. And that their rhythm and their rate and their prosody, sounds like they're trying to say something, a whole sentence. Me, 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 me. That's pretty startling. And then the last one, the most severe one, is called global aphasia. And this is where there are very few recognizable words, maybe none at all. Their comprehension is severely impaired. They're unable to read or write. And sometimes what we see is this global aphasia can be seen immediately post-stroke, but it may improve if the damage is not too extensive.
And across all of those, the person is still there, and the thinking is still there, and the intelligence is still there. And a lot of times, the hearing and understanding what's going on is still there in many of those cases.
In many of those cases, it's true. And it's very difficult for us to really know what's taking place, even in cases like global aphasia. I always try and imagine from a point of view of that other person how terrifying it must be when they feel that what they're internally thinking or what they're expressing is not understood. And we often hear people say when they've come out of a phase of this global aphasia or when they start to improve, I thought everybody was an idiot. I knew what I was saying was right, but nobody understood me.
That is just incredibly frustrating. I think when you think just for folks who haven't experienced aphasia, I think many of us have been in a meeting or had a conversation with a friend or a colleague or a potential significant other or whatever, and it's just like they're not listening to me, they're not hearing me, they don't get it. And imagine having to live that way with everybody you encounter.
Yeah, exactly. It is very isolating, very frustrating, very terrifying.
Now one of the other things that you work with is also the Nlp process. And this is something I've encountered in some of the online entrepreneur categories I've worked with, the folks who are really into self-improvement and changing your life. And I think a lot of folks who have encountered, you think of motivational speakers, you think of Tony Robbins, but it's not just about speaking, it's about an entire program for how you can transform your life and transform things. And NLP is a part of that, and that's something you're a specialist in as well. So can you tell us a little bit about what NLP is and how it helps with stroke survivors?
Sure. So NLP stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming, and it's essentially how to use the language of the mind to consistently achieve, your desired outcomes. It's a model of the way we communicate to ourselves and process information from events. So I like to say that when you are building a house, you want a carpenter that has a lot of tools and knows how to use those tools, right? So I think it's really important that we first and foremost look at a stroke survivor as a human being, right? You're first and foremost a human being and are entitled to all the life practices that are the best practices of the most successful people on the planet. So when I work with NLP, I think the easiest way to explain it is that we all process information differently. We have preferred input, as so to speak. Some of us are more visual people, some of us are more auditory, some are more kinesthetic, including that whole feeling sense. And the other ones are a little bit less dramatic, what we smell and what we taste. But primarily it's those three methods of really getting information into a brain. And
in some of the corporate trainings that I've done, I've tried to engage, get people to start tasting the computer devices, and I got asked not to come back.
Right. But you might, of course, want to talk to those people that are kinesthetic about how smooth it feels, how easy the keyboard works, and how effortlessly the actions are. Those language words speak to the words of a kinesthetic person. The language that speaks to an auditory person would say, listen how quiet it is, or how you get those little ding messages at the right time. The tone is so beautiful. And for a visual person, it's like you talk about how, smooth the glass is, how gorgeous the pixels are. You would know better than I, those visual terms that you need to talk about how clear the screen is. And when you start to use the language of that person, it's like a little magic key. It's all of a sudden that person feels like you understand them. And it's a much easier way to communicate.
And then the language that you're using when you're talking to somebody to help unlock and use that key to make that connection with them is one part of it. And the language that we use ourselves is another part of shaping our reality.
Absolutely. In fact, in my book, I have a chapter about that called, Change Your Language, Shape Your Life. It's really true. I mean, I think that the words that we use either magnify the good or they magnify the worst.
Yeah, and that's very true. And the more we repeat it, the more we develop those patterns in our brain. Again, all of the good things that neuroplasticity does for us, it can also do less effective things for us as well. It's really a neutral force. It becomes a question of how we want to deploy it, which is one of the reasons regular listeners know my favorite word is always the word yet. It's one thing to say, I can't use my left hand. It's another thing to say, I can't use my left hand yet.
Absolutely. That is brilliant. And I use that as well. And I think that's really important. Another word like that, a simple word like that is, it's only, right? It's only one day. It's only one more exercise to do. It's only one more. Or can you do just one more, right? And the only one you have to be careful with, you as a caregiver or another person outside that person, that is more in the wheelhouse of the actual person saying it to himself. Like you could say that to yourself versus somebody saying it to you.
And that's where we get to the difference of when you're saying it yourself and it's used and you're able to use it as motivational to get that done. Sort of that, in some respects, what we hear in the other recovery space, the one day at a time. Mm-hmm. And by the way, that's another one of those fun things in conversations when you start talking about rehab and recovery. If you don't qualify, a lot of people assume you're talking drugs and alcohol.
Right. Right.
So the language is always a fascinating thing from that perspective. But saying those things yourself is one thing. When somebody else says it, it can come across as patronizing, regardless of how they intend it. Because ultimately, communication is what the listener does. And that's what matters. And that's where those perceptions are going to happen. And a lot of folks with stroke experience or feel infantilized by the way people talk to them.
Yes, absolutely. And so this other aspect about NLP is that we all distort, generalize, and delete information. And you're absolutely right. There is a great risk of feeling infantilized as a stroke survivor, especially when you're deep in the hospital setting or at home with a caregiver and you feel personally limited. And this creates that dynamic that can be very difficult. So something that's not intended one way can be perceived that way because that's what we come with. We come with our own set of experiences, and then we distort, delete, and generalize information.
Obviously, that makes a lot of sense when we're talking about the stroke survivor, but how does NLP benefit then caregivers or folks who are outside of direct stroke world?
Well, one thing I want to say, too, is, first of all, if you can know and understand the language of your loved one, you know whether or not they're more of an auditory, visual, or kinesthetic learner, and adjusting your language to that. But something as simple as a language hack makeover, we talk about I've heard this from physicians. I've heard it from physical therapists. I've heard it from stroke survivors. They talk about their bad arm. Now, we need a way better language upgrade for that. So, stroke affected arm, the stroke affected side, but that's kind of long. I shorten that to SAS, and that turns to sassy for me. So when I think of a sassy arm, I think, well, I'm curious about that arm. When I think of a bad arm, I want to leave it alone. I want to neglect it. And that's the last thing we want somebody to do. We want them to pay attention to it. We want them to love it. We want them to get curious about it so that there is that potential to use it. And so I think that's one language upgrade that I definitely recommend. And another one that I talk about, talk about infantilizing when a person has to be in an adult panty, right? A diaper. I mean, really? I would probably want to hit somebody if they told me about the diaper. Now, some people can laugh about that and joke about it, but I think again, that's up to the survivor to do that. But I think it does promote still that diminished sense of being when you can just talk about briefs instead. I just think these simple changes make a difference.
They do. They absolutely do. And those are things we see throughout the community as talks about how we refer to ourselves. Are we people with disabilities or are we disabled? Are we Are we victims or are we survivors? All of those different words have different value and impact how we are going to go through life and how we are going to approach it.
Absolutely. And I love hearing survivors, quote, say they're thrivers or they're warriors. And I love thrivers because thrivers really says it all. Warriors is great too, especially when you're in that sort of fight mode. But I just love thrivers because those are people that are there and doing and gaining. And you can be a thriver at any stage of your recovery. And I think I think the language does influence how we feel about persistence and attainment and acceptance.
Yeah, it absolutely makes a difference. I often say that the victims are the ones who don't live through their stroke. Those of us who have made it past that and are still here are not victims. Yes.
And trust me, at the beginning, it is a big load to deal with. And I don't discount feeling those feelings. I can't begin to imagine, really. I can begin to imagine, and it's pretty awful. And yet, when I talk about it in my book, I tell the stories of the thrivers because I haven't experienced a stroke, so I can't profess to know how that feels. But the stories of the people that I've worked with have shown me so much. I always feel like I am the one that's receiving so much more.
Definitely an important thing. I think one of the other things to keep in mind too, when we talk about these stories that we hear, I think it's also helpful to keep in mind that the survivors or thrivers that you hear on this show and other shows and you see around the web, we are also a subset of folks who have survived a stroke, who are going out there and are comfortable telling our story and have the ability to tell our story and and want to tell our story. But we're also a small subset of the overall stroke community as well.
Agreed. And I think that having a podcast like this really offers the hope and the potential for somebody to find something they can latch onto to bring them further along.
So while we've been talking about this and trying to live this life we've been trying to work through over the last several years, Obviously, our world turned upside down. It is, as of recording this, it is July of 2020, or as many of us think about it, it's about the 152nd day of March. So, I mean, how has COVID-19 been impacting your work?
Well, I've actually gone to a virtual model, really. So I'm working with my patients online, and it's provided some very interesting experiences, actually. We never know what, when we think something is just like, we can't do this, it's going to be terrible, has actually proved to be pretty interesting in a lot of cases. It's not for everybody. Not everybody has technical savvy skills. Not everybody even has internet, and that's difficult for sure. But in many cases, it has been very interesting to work with people in this capacity, and they are starting to feel pretty empowered by learning this new skill.
And that's really valuable. I think one of those things we do is, as we live post-stroke, suddenly we're forced to come up with different ways of doing things. And I think the upside of COVID-19 has been an incredible forcing factor for shifts in technology and forcing people to figure out how to do things that otherwise we would say, oh, we could work on that in another 5 to 10 years.
Absolutely. And I think what happens too in these urgent situations, we are somehow equipped with more resources. And I don't mean external resources, I mean internal resources. Because there's an urgency to do this, all of a sudden we have more capacity to comprehend and to make things happen. I see that all the time with people at all different levels. I can't tell you how many quote bilingual, I'm not bilingual by any stretch, but I have helped people that are only Spanish speaking, that had no internet, that had no computer, get themselves up and running with the tools. I mean, it took a lot of time, I have to say, and it was exhausting, but it was kind of amazing. And there they are. Then they show up for our session. And one other thing I've started to do, I haven't started yet, I'm going to do it in August. I'm going to be speaking at a support group virtually. So that's an exciting thing to be a speaker at a caregiver support group and have them work through a caregiver recovery journal that I'm working on. So that's going to be really fun. And that's in Minnesota. I would never have, been able to do that.
One of the things I'm trying to do also is just, again, when it comes to how do I consume the news and things like that, it's like, okay, what are the real world experiences that are out there? In your working with, as a speech therapist, are there issues that you see patients of color dealing with that you don't observe in patients who are white?
Well, it's interesting you asked that. I think the most prominent thing I see around that is literally the materials that we use when we're either assessing a patient or actually using materials to guide therapy sessions. They are still really white. They're really white. They really are. I've also worked.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, the images are of white people for starters, or they sort of, they show a neighborhood or they show an experience that just feels limited from a point of view. So I also work with a lot of kids and more inner city kids, Hispanic and African American. And sometimes I show them pictures and I think, this is not their neighborhood. This is not their environment. This does not, it just seems so weird. It just doesn't seem like it fits. So I think that traditionally published therapeutic materials are still very much geared from the people that make them. And they reflect what we perceive as, our everyday experience.
And I think one of the things that's interesting about that, when we talk about those hardwired automatic scripts earlier, when you're asked to assess a visual, an image, what's going on there, when the context of that image is very much the context of your personal culture, that's going to more likely kick into some of those pre-scripted behaviors and establish a connection a lot faster while wasting a lot less brain power than if you're being asked to describe something that is not the core of your culture.
I agree. And I think that's one of the benefits right now of actually being in this virtual or remote kind of therapy sessions, because we're in their homes, right? I mean, it's a very sacred and very personal responsibility when you are in somebody's home. I did a lot of home care, mostly in New York and then out here in California, where I would go into patients' homes and then into the community with them. So where we're in their community, in their homes, this is functional and relevant to them. It's not some prepackaged kind of program that we're trying to fit it over them, right? So I think that is a positive aspect of making therapy much more relevant by being in your own home, being in your own community.
It connects to those real world things that we want anyway, those benefits from that sales process, those different language and learning processes. It all comes together in the community and the home that we are a part of.
Absolutely.
I remember when I was in the ER and they're doing their initial assessments, they show me the picture. I think most of us have seen it at some point that you're describing, which is sort of the woman in the A-line dress doing dishes and the kids climbing up to steal cookies out of the cabinet. And I'll post a copy of that in the show notes. But they asked me to describe what was going on in the picture. And I just said 1954.
Right. And so I, as a therapist, would totally laugh at that, right? But some other therapists might have said, limited ability to speak, answered, didn't have the bandwidth to describe what the picture was. But I would totally think that was hilarious. And I would agree with you. And I'd go, yeah, right.
And that gets to then again, how we process information, the conclusions we're able to draw from it, and just sometimes our own natural snarkiness, which may interfere with accurate medical assessments of our condition.
But, that's what I loved about working with all of my patients, is really seeing their individuality and how they do process information. I worked with a gentleman who was a Superior Court judge. When he came in, he had had an aneurysm. And, the first view I had of him was he had that hemi haircut, right? Because when they have to clean up an aneurysm, they shave half your head because they say, first do no harm, and they have to focus in on the area. So anyway, so he looks kind of
I've always
insane.
wondered why they don't just shave the whole head and call it good.
That's what I think too. But it falls under the category of first do no harm. So they, in their assessment, they are only taking care of the area that is that way. You and I might think it's harmful that look like an insane person with a hemi haircut. But that's another story. So he has this haircut. I go to speak with him, and he looks pretty terrified. And not a single sound that came out of his mouth was a real word. It was just this fractured syllables and, that desperate longing and looking in his eyes. And I could see, okay, this was a big problem. This was a Superior Court judge. He's fallen quite a distance from, you start to look at, it's like, is this guy going to ever go back to work? But as we progressed throughout this period of time, I could see he had such a funny sense of humor, even before he had any words to describe it. His nonverbal language would show that. He'd roll his eyes. We would, you could start to see who this man was. Well, let me fast forward 2 parts, if it's okay. Can I share this story?
Sure,
okay.
Absolutely.
So very early on in therapy, I was so excited because now I had laid down 5 different objects. You have to understand, he couldn't, I would say, show me the cup. He couldn't even do that. He couldn't point to the cup. He didn't seem to understand anything, much less be able to say anything. So after working for quite a while, I was thrilled. He had 5 objects down or 10 objects. I can't recall exactly right now, but he pointed to every single one, and I was thrilled. This was huge progress. And I went, trotting down the hospital aisle with my clipboard. I was so excited to talk to his wife, and I said, you should hear, he pointed to five objects. And she looked at me with this ghastly look, and she said, oh, hon, we have very different baselines. And she was right. She was right, because here was this, Stanford educated Superior Court judge who routinely spoke in, 4-syllable words. That was his style. And now, I was thrilled that he could do this, but I was also right, because this is where he was right now. And just like you say, he can't do it yet, but this is where he was right now. Well, fast forward further. After about 2 years of very intense therapy, I only saw him in the acute rehab hospital, but he went on for other physical, occupational, and speech therapy for 2 years. And then he underwent extensive neuropsychological testing because he started to go back into the courtroom as a listener. He was listening first, and he could read. That was one of his strengths. He could definitely read. At any rate, after all this neuropsych testing and all of this therapy, he actually went back to the bench and served for another 10 years on the bench after that stroke. And he had a secondary aneurysm that they saw. And so they clipped, and they had to do a surgical procedure while he was still in the hospital that I was working with him on. That ability to be snarky and have that nonverbal communication is I think a tremendous asset that maybe is not, if you just looked at it as it was, you couldn't see the value and the true value of that ability behind everything else as a motivating factor to communicate.
And yeah, exactly. It's so much more than just what is the immediate response and how does it fit in the form?
Yeah, exactly.
So, in your experience, do you see, you mentioned folks who are working in a different language with technology earlier. Do you see multilingual patients having an easier or harder time recovering speech than monolingual patients?
Every brain is so different, and that's the refrain that is most often so hard for people to hear because we can't come up with definitive answers. But I would say that very often they do revert back to their primary language. So if a person, spoke a particular language for most of their life, oftentimes they do revert back to that language and have more difficulty with English. I'm working with a woman right now who was born in the U.S. Her family is Indian, and she actually went back to India to do some schooling, and she had a terrible car accident there. And her English, and she spoke English, but her English is now more influenced by the accent of her primary family and the Indian language, whereas she grew up here speaking sort of standard American English and now has more of an influence of the accent of an Indian accent.
When you talk about it reverting back to sort of that accent she probably encountered more when she was first learning to speak English, it's, obviously it's not the same thing, but, I know when I am extremely tired, or it's probably going to start happening now.
I heard it.
Yep, there it is. Once I start talking about accents, my New York accent suddenly surges forward again. or when alcohol may be a factor. But
and if you get together with your buddies.
Oh yeah, we'll be talking like this for weeks.
Exactly. My husband is from New Jersey, and when he gets together with his New Jersey friends, all of a sudden it's lunch, which is funny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my girlfriend's father had a similar experience. He had a stroke, and he had grown up speaking a rather old dialect of Cantonese.
Wow.
And he's lived in the United States since the 60s, but lost all of his English for about 3 weeks, and then it basically just came right back.
See, the thing is, every brain is so different. Everybody's experience is different. Everybody's education is different. Everybody's general composition is so different. So we don't know what's going to happen or how to predict something. I work with a gentleman who'd had a stroke. He was an African-American gentleman who obviously spoke English. He spoke beautiful English, and he suddenly started sounding like he was British. British. And he had no family history of being British. I mean, it was the oddest, funniest thing. But he had the cadence and the pronunciation of a British person. It didn't last that long, but I would say it lasted many months.
It's fascinating. I think, a lot of times when we lose things in our brain, whether that's information, whether that's a language, whether that's a skill, it's not that it's lost or that it's gone. It's that the index in the brain to get to that is gone.
Exactly. And I love to describe it as just imagine you've got all these fantastic filing cabinets, and then a crane comes and dumps all of the filing cabinets out all over the place. You haven't lost the information, but if you have to try and retrieve that one report somewhere, it's going to take a lot of time. And that's exactly what you're describing as the way the brain indexes information and how it finds it and how it can get there.
And then I know you talked about that in your book as well. So can you tell us a little bit more about this book?
Yes. So the book is called Hope After Stroke for Caregivers and Survivors, the Holistic Guide to Getting Your Life Back. And the reason I wrote this book is because I felt like, well, first of all, it really honestly came to me during a meditation. And I was kind of surprised by it, but the decision to write the book was I wanted to take people through from beginning, and I'm not going to say end because there's no end, right? There is no end, but from the beginning part of, what happened to what next and what now. Those stages of having your life upended, catastrophically changed, unprepared. I know you've said in the past, it was never on your radar to think about if I ever have a stroke. It just wasn't a thought you had in your mind. And most people don't have that in their minds. But then all of a sudden, when you are thrust into this situation, you have to take this crash course in anatomy and physiology and jargon and trying to understand what's happening, answering all of these kinds of questions. The intention behind the book was to really be that therapist next to both the caregiver and the person who's had the stroke to help them through that initial process of being in the hospital and then transitioning to, what's next coming home. You see, there's plenty of information out there, but there's not information in one place that you can get that really key down information that I know people go through. I mean, having worked for more than 25 years with stroke survivors and their families in every setting, that means the acute care setting, the rehab setting, community setting, home setting, actual residential setting. I know what people want to know. It's the same questions they want to know. And I wanted to make sure that they understood the language, that it wasn't just jargon for them, because I want people to participate in their recovery. Those that participate in their recovery can have a much better outcome. And part of being able to, and for example, I know that you work in the tech world. Well, I go to talk to my web designer. I don't even know the question to ask her. It's just like, how can you make me look good? Like, I don't have the language. I don't know what questions to ask. And so I addressed the questions that most people do ask and then gave them the language to ask them. So then we talk about what's next, coming home, and how to prepare for coming home before you leave a hospital even, involving the caregiver and trying to help them understand, rewarding rituals and getting a grip from themselves, managing your mindset, finding meaning, and how to manage that anxiety that comes up. People are always asking, they feel so fatigued and they go, do I push through or do I rest? Like, there's always trying to figure out that balance. And then I address the topic of sex, because in more than 25 years, I can't even tell you how infrequently anybody has addressed that issue with them. Not that I'm the person to do it. I'm not the correct professional, but I want to make sure that somebody feels empowered enough to ask the question. Let's get real. It's not that it's not on people's mind, but they haven't provided this friendly environment to actually discuss something that is a vital part of somebody's life. That's why I call it the holistic. It's not because I'm talking about woo-woo practices, although some of the things that I talk about in there may seem that way to some people, but it's the holistic, meaning that it's the whole of the person. And then what now? Making it work when everyone leaves and you have to get back to your own life when you're not going to therapy. Looking at those things like driving and working, and yes, facing those days that are crappy. And then plowing through what seem like apparent plateaus. And I end my book with a chapter on forgiveness, acceptance, and reinvention. And again, I don't profess to know those secrets, but I do share what my thrivers share, the many stories. So there are many stories throughout the book that talk from the point of view of the real person. And so I think it combines both the evidence base that you need, as well as the personal stories, as well as just the common sense, practical things.
And those are the resources that people are looking for.
Yeah. And then at the end, I do have a whole list of resources too that might make life easier for everybody, as well as a glossary of terms. So you can go back to that, and a glossary of the types of strokes. So as a person does, some people are more interested in finding out the medical details, and they're wanting to look at their hospital records, wanting to sort of research that period of time that maybe their brain wasn't at the optimal level for understanding everything, but going back and putting those puzzle pieces together. I definitely encourage that for those who want to do that.
I'm actually going through that process currently. 3 years later, I just got all of my medical records from the hospital and starting to work through those various reports and see what everybody was saying about me. And
right.
It's made it into some of my official bios now, but my medical records describe me as pleasant. I'm like, I'll take that.
Pleasant and snarky. I would have said, have said funny sense of humor. Quick-witted.
And we found the blurbs for my LinkedIn.
Great.
So with all these different publishing methods these days of self-publishing, hybrid publishing, traditional publishing, how did you decide to publish your book the way you did?
So I decided to go the self-publishing route. And the reason I did, I've written other things. I've been published author for 15 different anthologies for Chicken Soup for the Soul. I'm a writer for Thrive Global, which is a Huntington Press I've been a writer on numerous websites like I Love Recovery Cafe, which is the largest online. That kind of recovery is actually drug and alcohol recovery. So I have gone into traditional publishing. For me, because I wanted to write the book I wanted to write, and I wanted to do it quickly, maybe it had to do with I'm turning 65 next month, but this was a couple of years ago that I wrote it, and then, because it's a process, obviously, to write it and then to publish it, et cetera, et cetera. But, my mother died at the age of 64, and my dad at the age of 68. And as I was approaching this age, I said, I really want something to last. I want to leave something behind. And this is something completely within my control. I don't need to have somebody tell me when I can publish it. I don't need to have somebody tell me when the manuscript is due. I can write it. I can find my editor. I can choose my book designer. I can choose and find the people that are going to do my illustrations, and I can tell the story that I want to tell. And that was really compelling to me. And so often we are involved in things that, we have to wait for somebody or and we have to rely on somebody else. This was all within my control. I could set a deadline for myself and say, I'm going to write 500 words today or 1,000 words today. I'm going to have, this chapter done by a certain date. And then I found a fantastic editor. In the intro to my book, I say, if it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a planet to write a book. And I did connect with people. My formatter is from Macedonia. My illustrator was from Sri Lanka. My editor was from back east in Massachusetts. Who else did I involve in this process? I'm trying to remember, but it was fantastic. So I was able to connect with all these wonderful people and really produce something that I thought was great. And, if anybody does want to self-publish a book, I still think you need to follow the protocol of getting an editor and getting a proofreader to make sure that you're putting out a quality book. And it's so funny, because I've written, and I think I'm pretty good at writing, when I submitted my manuscript to my editor, which I revised many, many times. I went through it many, many times. And I was like, okay, she is going to send it back to me and she's going to say, wow, I hardly had to do a thing. I can't believe it. And of course, that did not happen. She sent it back to me. She sent me back 13 pages of editorial comment, including a minor suggestion to completely rewrite the entire thing. Which I have to say caused me a moment of pause, more than a moment. I mean, it was like, whoa, okay. And I had to look at each of these things very individually. And at some point, and some things most I yielded to her objective editorial opinion. And I changed those things. And she pushed and she prodded me in certain areas. Like, for example, in the area about the chapter on let's get physical. Yep, I'm talking sex. I guess, in my own sort of scared way, approached it very minimally. And she really said, I forget her exact words, but she said, it's kind of like you're giving them, this chapter is like the booby prize. It's not much of anything. So I put on my courageous girl pants and I really dug in deep, and I spoke to more people and did more research, and she was absolutely 100% right. Now, one thing that many people asked me about as I was writing it, it was like, well, who's the book for? Is it for the caregiver or the survivor? And I always had to say, it's for both. It's really for both. It's such a dance. I know not every stroke survivor has a particular person in their life. Most do. Most have somebody, whether it's, an actual spouse or a girlfriend or a family member, there's usually at least some person in their life. Some, not all. And I even write about one guy in particular who was very much on his own. But this concept that it is for both the survivor and the caregiver because it's a dance. And the dance takes place at the beginning where the caregiver is doing more of the leading, and ultimately the survivor is the one that leads. So that was an area that I just said, it's for both. I did not, and another editor actually helped me say that and say, put it right up front that it's for the caregiver and survivor. You might want to know who's it for. Well, it's for both. End of story.
And that's some of the value in having that outside perspective. It's going to share things that you just don't see. And it comes from whether we're doing any kind of writing or creative process. Part of it comes from just so much in our own head that, that's absolutely the core of where it needs to be. But it's also limited by our own perspectives, and a third party can make such a huge difference in that. In some respects, it ties into some of the experience that people may have with aphasia, where you have all of this, everything that's right in your head. When you start trying to speak and start trying to share it, it's the folks outside who see that, well, maybe this isn't as clear as it needs to be. Absolutely.
And my editor was fantastic too about showing me how to put the arrangement together, the flow of the book. Whereas when I thought of putting a chapter at a further point in the book, she said, put it up in the front of the book so that there is something hopeful there. So that, blind spot feedback that we get is very, very valuable. It's important to work with a person that you have a good relationship with in terms of, are you willing to hear what they have to say and really evaluate it? And so it was very, very helpful to do that. But there are a lot of moving parts to putting your own book together. It is quite a process. I learned so much in doing that. It's been amazing.
Would you do it again?
I will. And in fact, I'm actually working on the companion journal / workbook. So it's not quite a 344-page manuscript, but it is, many of the same elements of knowing how to lay it out and how the information that you want to give and getting feedback and making sure that it's relevant. So yes, I would definitely do it again.
And that brings us to our hack of the week.
But one thing that I really like, this is what I believe first and foremost. We are therapists and we sort of help people, but the real person that does all the work is the person themselves, right? So it's about your mindset as a person who is in recovery and is recovering. I like to say it's not a destination. It's an ongoing state. And so your daily practice for preparing your brain for everything that it needs to encounter is what's really critical. So one of the things that I do, I have a practice of a morning practice of meditation. And, with or without a brain injury, this is something I recommend for everybody. Now, a lot of people go, I can't meditate. My mind's too busy. I don't have the time. I don't know how to do it. It looks weird. There is so much out there, so many free apps, so many YouTube videos. What I like to say is start with mindfulness and start with just a few minutes of mindfulness. And I like to think of it as like preparing yourself before you go out, right? Before you look at your email, before you look at your news, before you get involved in your life, spend a few wakeful minutes of your time to prepare yourself so that when you go into the world, you're not that, ping pong, like in a pinball machine. You're not that puck that gets flipped around by this. You have a sort of center and a base. An easy way to do that Like I said, I mean, there are plenty of apps out there to sit with for mindfulness. And, it can be just as easy as sitting down and breathing and called coming to your senses, right? With your eyes closed, come to your senses. And that is find one thing that you feel like in your body. What do you feel? Whether it's you feel your weight of your bottom sitting on a chair. So find one thing that you feel, find one thing that you hear, whether it's the outside noise. People think that you have to be in isolation to meditate. That's not true. You can incorporate the sounds of the outside and just recognize them without judgment. So one thing you hear, one thing you see, even behind your eyes closed, you can see light and you can see flicks of this and that. Come to one thing you smell and one thing you taste. And this centered awareness just brings about a conscious mindfulness that is really, really helpful. And allow yourself to just breathe for a few minutes.
Awesome. Well, Tsgoyna, this has been fantastic. If folks want to know more about you and what you're up to, where should they go?
Great. It has been. Thank you so much, Bill. Well, they can find me at hope-stroke.com. That's my website, hope-stroke.com. And they can also email me at hopeafterstroke@gmail.com. And if any of your listeners want, I'd be happy to send them my mini sample of a recovery journal, my workbook and recovery journal. It's a 21-day recovery journal where it helps people sit down and practice some of those morning skills of affirming and recognizing gratitude practice, checking in to make sure that they've got that organizational self-care for their meds and their water and their exercise. And I'm happy to send that to them for free.
Fantastic. And we're going to have links to that in the show notes and over at strokecast.com. Again, thanks so much for joining us. This has been, I've taken up more of your time than I expected, and but I just keep getting carried away in this conversation. This has been great.
Well, thank you. It's been really a pleasure talking to you too, and I think your podcast is phenomenal for stroke survivors out there. It's such a breath of fresh air, and I love your intro because you right up front you tell me that you can peel a banana with one hand, and I think that's hilarious.
The book is called Hope After Stroke, and you can find it on Amazon. The links will be in the show notes for episode 108 and at strokecast.com/hopeafterstroke. In other news, I joined Carmen Wyckoff on her podcast to talk about life, disability, stroke, and neuroplasticity. On Freewheelin' with Carden, Carden talks with guests about their experiences going through life with different disabilities, about the nature of accessibility, the impact of the Americans with Disabilities Act here in the United States, and how we can all work to combat ableism and to push for a more accessible world. You can find the Freewheelin' with Carden podcast in your favorite podcast app and at freewheelinwithcarden.com. You'll also find links in the show notes for this episode, again, at strokecast.com/hopeafterstroke. And that's it for this week. To get your free sample of Tsgoyna's recovery journal, head on over to hope-stroke.com or just follow the links at strokecast.com/hopeafterstroke. For more podcast goodness, check out Freewheelin' with Carden wherever you get your podcasts, or just follow the links at strokecast.com/hopeafterstroke. Share this episode with 3 other people you know by giving them the link strokecast.com/hopeafterstroke. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you soon.
The Strokecast, Bill Monroe, and Bill's guests provide general information and entertainment, not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting your personal doctor or medical team. The Strokecast is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.